Productive Pastor 15 questions as part of the sermon process. What's going on, friends? Welcome back to the podcast, episode 15, questions for preaching. How do we use questions as part of the sermon process? That might seem like it's kind of a wild and different thing, but I think questions can be really, really powerful to think about as we just in the entire sermon ecosystem. Over the last few weeks, I believe that Theory Land is fun and Action Land is fun. And for the last few weeks, we've been in Theory Land a lot, and it was necessary. We did some Action Land stuff in there, but we've been in Theory Land a lot. I've had some fantastic communication and just conversation about that over at the Productive Pastor community on Facebook. But Action Land's a lot of fun, and I want to live in Action Land for the next couple of weeks with you, and this is a great way to do it. Think about questions as part of the sermon process. So we're just going to jump straight into the content. If you're looking for the show notes, and there's going to be a lot of links and a lot of links to resources as well in the show notes. That's revchadbrooks.com/pp/015. So let's get into it all the way. So why do we use questions for preaching? And in general, like, what's so good about questions anyway? I love questions. And questions are fantastic, especially the good questions, especially the right questions, because they help us to embrace ourselves and the process is we're trying to just be the best that we can be. Questions that make us say yes to things. They make us say yes to life. They make us say yes to our call. They make us say yes to exploration. They make us say yes to experimentation. They make us say yes to change. If we live a life where we're not scared to ask questions and be comfortable with questions, we're going to be restricted. And just getting in the pattern of asking questions ourselves, like to ourselves personally, can really help out with that. So it's kind of the bigger realm of questions, and that's not a new thing with the podcast. So, but the next thing, why use questions for preaching? No preaching islands. I talked about this on a previous episode, but preaching islands are these places where we can get to as preachers when our sermons begin getting separated from the mainland. I've written a couple of blog posts about this. I'll have those linked in the show notes. But, when we get separated from the mainland in our preaching, that's when our sermons become separated from the mission of our individual churches. And there's all sorts of reasons that this can happen. I'm not going to go into those here, but questions help us unintentionally avoid forming islands by keeping our context and our community in the middle of our sermon preparation. Even though this is a thing that we do in private, it allows us to do this alongside of, figuratively and maybe even literally, the people that we are leading with and the people that we're leading to. Questions are also great for preaching because they let us to name our assumptions. I remember one time when I was in seminary, I wrote a paper, and it was for a 700 level class. It was my first 700 level class. And I made some assumptions on the front end, and this teacher thankfully made us turn in rough drafts and final drafts. And in the rough draft, she said, "Chad, you're making an absolute lot of assumptions about things here." And that's okay. You can make those assumptions, but name the assumptions in the footnotes. That teacher also taught me how to write in the footnotes, which was a lot of fun. But name your assumptions. If you have something that's driving you or that you're passionate about, or it might be one of the primary lenses you are using in sermon preparation, just name the assumption. I'm living in an assumption right now. I think that preaching needs to not be done on an island by itself as a standalone part of the church, but it needs to be a major part of the church's overall discipleship, and thinking about the sermon is just another ministry that the church does. And so I've been reflecting on that very, very heavily. But you get to name your own assumptions. A healthy version of this, I do think, means naming these assumptions alongside of other leaders. And we're going to talk about just kind of why questions and other people are important further on the podcast. But these questions help us explore to continue moving deeper into our learning of things and our investigation of things. And so just name your assumptions, and your questions let you name your assumptions. Your questions also, they help you develop your weak places. For me, I always struggle with finishing things. And it's not that I have a hard time with too much content. I've gotten that part under control. But I just don't know how to end things. I kind of prefer just to leave with this. I don't know. I'm working on it. I've always been working on it. So conclusions, application, calls to action, whatever you want to call it. So the most current version of the sermon worksheet, and there's a link to that in the show notes. You can tell with those handful of blocks at the bottom, it's just some questions. I make sure I spend time doing this. And so when you know you've got a weak space in your preaching, you can develop questions alongside of that to always keep you focusing on growing that space. So let's talk about how to develop your own questions, because I'm about to give you a bunch of questions in this episode, but I don't think you should always use my questions. I think you should come up with your own questions. I also think that you can come up with better questions for your context than I can come up with for your context. And so developing your own questions, a couple things. One, it's the spaces of conviction that we have. They help you form questions. For me, currently, right now, for the last 6 months, I have been in thick with Charles Taylor's work, A Secular Age, and y'all, it is gigantanormous. And I've been reading all the other related books that have lived in this ecosystem of a secular age. So Jamie Smith's How Not to Be Secular. I've gone and found a bunch of Taylor's article writing and this sort of thing. I'm living in a world of Charles Taylor right now, because I feel like it's making me think about what does ministry look like in 2022. And in Taylor, one of his big things is this idea of immanence and transcendence. And to Taylor, he's using this language to describe, transcendence as an idea that people relate to God that they cannot touch, they cannot see, that there are things in life and world they cannot explain, and they're okay with the divine being a transcendent entity to them. Taylor's a Catholic sociologist, but let's just say that the Catholic is a lot smaller than the word sociologist. And so he deals with religion, but he thinks about sociologically, which I like it a lot. So that sort of thing. Immanence means that your deity is right in front of you, that God is right in front of you, that you can control it, that you can touch it, that you can explain it. And he talks how much of the last 150, 200 years has been us trying to explain God by justifying things. And that's a short version of a very, very long thing. And that's not nearly well enough to explain Charles Taylor. But that's been a big influence on my preaching, because I have become especially careful to not be creating moments of immanence in my preaching. And so that's not that difficult for me, but I'm staying away from the 5 ways to make your coffee better on a Monday so you love your children type message, but not trying to say these are things you can control, these are the things that you can touch, but instead inviting people to become comfortable with the fact that God is all-knowing and all of the omnis, but that he is outside of our realm and he lives in a bigger world. So that's kind of a quick, and that's probably not the best explanation of it, but I'm inviting people into something that we can't touch, into that mystery of faith. And I ask myself a lot of questions along those sorts of lines. We also have to ask ourselves this: how is the Spirit asking us to grow right now? I did a live stream about one of my favorite questions is, what do I know to be true? And how to use that for just congregational discernment overall. And doing this with other people. You can do it by yourself, but if you do it by yourself, if you always do all these things just by yourself, you're going to be living with just your vision and your understanding of these things. But that question, what do I know to be true? And doing that with others, it's a weird blend of strategic missional design that I love talking about. I love working with other people on this if they want to bring me in to help lead these conversations with their leadership. But we also, when we do that activity, we can begin finding pieces. Remember how I said the sermon is part of the larger missional strategy of the church, the larger discipleship strategy, that when we ask these questions, like what do we know to be true? What do we know to be true? We can begin finding pieces of this that can significantly inform all of our sermon preparation, of the things that we are talking about, the text that we use, the ways that we're directing the sermon, the ways, all those sorts of things. And so that congregational spirit of discernment, of how is the Spirit asking us to grow, use that what would be true exercise that's there. And then also it's what I call the 4 Jesus questions. We use this at the church we started almost 10 years ago. And we used it as part of missional design, but I think it also can play into the sermon space, just like what do I know to be true? I call them the 4 Jesus questions. Where would Jesus spend his time? Who would he spend his time with? How would he reach people? And what issues would he care about? And every time I did this exercise with people publicly, we did like big, huge Post-it notes on the wall, that whiteboards, that sort of thing. I kept telling them, no generic answers, no generic answers, no world answers, no Sunday school answers. Like, let's get down into the nitty-gritty of our community. In fact, the first part of it was really an assumption based off of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Like, since Jesus lives in our community, where would he spend his time? Or since Jesus lives in our community, who would he spend his time with? Like, get down to the granular level as much as you can, because by doing this, you will find a lot of clarity that can inform maybe your larger preaching calendar, or help you understand that, I might be living on an island where, especially if you're not from that community, if you're not from that region or area, if you're not from the same socioeconomic level, all those sorts of things, asking those questions will help you not be on an island, but also genuinely speaking directly to where people are at. And so those are kind of this why questions matter, and then how to develop your own questions. So what I'm going to do now is I want to kind of go through a couple of sets of questions to ask that are more kind of at the individual sermon level. So we ask questions about organization and focus. I think it's important for us as a pastor, and we want to sit down and do kind of like a sermon audit to ask ourselves the question, how do I preach? So like, what is my my larger format or template? Do I have a kind of normal, repeatable action that's there? I think we ask ourselves the question, how do I prepare? Do we are we fairly like go week by week, exact same rhythm, exact same schedule? We've got this under control. Everybody knows don't bug you when your office door is shut between these hours and these hours. Or are you kind of just running off the seat of your pants? Like, how do you prepare, and what is typical for you is going to inform some of this stuff. There's also the idea of, where do I want to focus on my preaching? This comes back to that discernment piece, a lot of those work we did, but where am I wanting to focus on preaching? And when I'm getting into my individual messages, am I able to keep that focus? Or does all that focus go away when it gets time to actually begin starting my messages? There's how do I begin sermons, and how do I end sermons? Thinking of how you normally and typically do that, and then ask questions. Okay, does me always beginning the same way, or is me always ending the same way? Is that creating a level of predictability that may or may not be a good thing for my congregation right now? So really, like, any of the places where you feel like you need to apply focus inside of your preparation or your process, or maybe if there's places you want to get better inside of your preaching, ask yourselves questions about it and follow this. I think Toyota developed it originally, but they called it the 5 whys. And so when you get to a place where you're feeling kind of stumped, ask, okay, well, why is this the case? If okay, so I always start off sermons telling a joke about my kids. Okay, why do you always start off sermons telling a joke about your kids? Think that through. And then you come to that answer, because it's the easiest thing to do. Okay, why is it the easiest thing for me to do? And that might, I really struggle with learning how to start my sermons. Okay, why do you always struggle? Y'all are getting the drift by now, but we can use these questions, and then if you come to a breaking point, just the 5 whys. Ask yourself why 5 times, and you'll probably get down to a place of tremendous clarity. So 2 different types of questions that we use. It's the first side of this we've talked about a lot already, but there's the questions of discernment. And I think that where we drill down here is all of that work we've done before is really, really good pre-work, where we've built kind of a missional library of sorts. But we think about the discernment questions that we have. And this kind of, like I said, I rattled off some bullet points here. Your questions that you develop intentionally are going to be 10 times better than my questions. So call these examples, call these starting places. But is this, how is Jesus being faithfully expressed in my community? How are the ways you see people engaging with Jesus and that sort of thing? What does that sound like on Facebook? I think that's a huge thing. How do people talk about Jesus on Facebook? What does Christian expression look like in a good space in your community? And there's also, how is Jesus being unfaithfully expressed in my community? That could be an interesting thing. I made a joke one time about a barbecue restaurant that was playing bro country and worship music. And so you'd hear some horrible, immoral song about something was happening on a dirt road in the back of a pickup truck. And then you'd hear like Reckless Love by Corey Asbury. It's like, I don't think these two things are supposed to belong together. But that made me begin asking a lot of questions about cultural Christianity in my community. And how do I talk about cultural Christianity in my community? How do I talk about Christian uniqueness in my community? How do I talk about Christian identity in my community? So there's just one example of how we see that expression happening. Think about this. What are the celebrations in your community? How do you take the cultural draw together that's happening in a moment and use that to reinforce beliefs in Jesus Christ? I remember our community is, I think, 2016, we flooded pretty bad, and almost all the churches that Sunday decided just to meet together in the biggest sanctuary because it was just going to be the easiest and best things because people were still running boat crews and stuff. And I remember just talking to people about this feeling that we all had for days of disaster, but also this huge community formation because everybody was helping each other. And I just talked about that a little bit that morning. So what are the celebrations in your community? But also, what are the pain points in your community? I think that it's very easy for us to be drawn into pain points across the world. I think where we really can make a difference from the pulpit is when we speak about the pain points in our community. And what are those looking like? And that goes alongside of our mission stuff really, really well. There's also that just massive question, what do I know to be true? I promise you, playing that exercise with people, getting used to doing that exercise, that lets you know so many things about your community. So think of the work that you might be doing personally and with others from that conviction space, and you will most likely end up getting a bunch of different questions that are all completely related. And I think this is the type of questions. This helps us close things. This helps us start things. This gives us a really, really good why, a really good entry point into how does the Bible apply into our world today, whatever wrestling we have going on. But there's a lot of power right there rather than just kind of randomly like grabbing passages that sound fun to preach that week. Because, friends, that's a preaching island. Okay, so questions in preparation. These are the kind of things that I ask myself, and there's all sorts of versions of this. And here's the thing. I don't always ask myself all of these. Don't think I have some massive 4-page list of questions I run through. Use questions when you get stuck, or also you learn to develop different questions based off of like what type of passage you're using. So when I'm preaching out of especially the synoptic gospels, I'll always ask the question, who are all of the characters here? Because I know that's a big, huge thing. If I'm preaching out of like the historical books, I always look, okay, what's going on in the land around here? I've learned those things, but question and preparation. So think about this. So what is the most important thing for me to communicate in this passage? Asking that question will help us like focus our sermon work and not just chase rabbits all over the place and then try to pull 30 minutes of content out of it. How does this call to our modern soul? So where is the friction point here that speaks to my community in 2022? Is there a place inside of church tradition that is doing the same thing or trying to do the same thing as one of these important things in the passage? Who or what is the primary antagonist in the passage? Especially for narrative things, just watching the characters is huge. Or who or what is the primary protagonist in this story? Identifying those and looking at the whys behind what might be going on to make them that way. Is there an ancient practice that would really give light to my teaching here? I think I've talked about this a couple episodes ago. When I went deep into the story of Hezekiah and his father and Isaiah, y'all, I could have preached like 10 messages based off of that interplay. And so, like, what was the thing that actually made Ahaz bow down to the Babylonians or to Sennacherib? Well, I'll tell you what it was. This is what it looked like to be subjugated. This is where idolatry came into control. And that made a passage that was, fairly outside of a modern day purview extremely relevant. We can say the question, what do you place your trust in? And you have this big, huge story about trust. My last question is this: is anything happening in Israel's history or the geography of the place that would help me tell a better story? That last example is a perfect example of that.
And then some questions about your motivation and things like, am I being faithful to the deeper character of God, or am I using this text to just prove a point? That's the honest thing we have to come to terms with. And that's about keeping it in community, staying off those preaching islands. Where are my biggest places of transition in this message? Do I have a spot that's just troublesome and problematic? How can I make this as seamless as possible? And just focus, and just spending 5 or 10 minutes sometimes on that transition can be just huge. The work of Nancy Duarte, especially her book Resonate, is just great content about how to make moves between just points of stories like that. And then also, just at the end of the day, what am I asking people to do? And nailing down that, especially if you struggle with conclusions, that's a very good question. There's all sorts of questions. So that's all of my questions for you. Like I told you, remember, I don't use my questions as a start off point. You are going to develop better questions for your context than I'm going to develop on a podcast for your context. So how do I use questions? Personally, the more kind of the idea, the physical idea. Well, I put them on my sermon worksheet. There will be a download of that in the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/015. Here's my dirty secret. What I'm using as my current sermon worksheet right now is not the one that y'all have that's up there. It's actually not odd at all for me to kind of revise that worksheet every month because of the questions. Because the questions I'm asking myself whenever I put together a sermon worksheet and publish it, it's not necessarily the one I'm using at the moment. It's the one who I kind of, those bottom 2 or 3 blocks usually have questions on them. And those are the ones I have found to be the most useful across a length of time. And sometimes I'll use those. Sometimes I just scratch out and write a new question over the one on the sheet because the whole bottom half of that sermon worksheet are my focus and my goal areas. And so what you see on the published sheet is the questions that stuck around the longest. And every 6 months or so, I'll probably end up revising that. So use them as far as your worksheet or whatever you're doing practically. Then there's also series design. I think this is a very interesting thing to think about as far as sermon questions are done. What might it mean to find a group of people to ask questions that deserve to be asked, especially during a vision series or a mission series, to think about what questions should we be asking the congregation. And be asking the congregation that use those questions maybe in the sermon series, use those questions in small groups, maybe have a couple of interactive spaces where you use those questions, or think about it when you are walking through a book together, especially like a smaller book where you can get really, really in depth in a quick amount of time, like some of Paul's letters, the book of Jonah, the book of James, that sort of thing. What if you made those questions into the different points of the series? And those questions recurred every week. So you came up with 3 really solid questions as you're going through the book of 1 Peter. And every week during the sermon, a major part of the teaching is asking those 3 questions and trying to answer those 3 questions. And it recurs every week. And that way you get the congregation involved in answering these questions and talking about these questions. And so that's why I think questions are such a powerful thing to be using as you work on sermons. And I think that especially now, kind of this post-COVID reality, and also I talk to so many pastors realizing that we're spending a lot of time working by ourselves, or we're not necessarily, we might have an administrator there, you might have a part-time youth person there, but a lot of our sermon work sometimes seems to be done in isolation. And questions are a way to keep us from isolating, to keep us from building those islands, that sort of thing. So that's how I use questions as part of the sermon process. And I think we covered a lot of waters. We covered about questions for the beginning of things, questions for while we were preparing, about using questions as part of our presentation in the congregation, all that sort of thing. And I think sermon conversations are always fun. Sermon podcasts are fun. Sermon episodes are fun. And I hope this was helpful for you. I think questions invite us to change, and we take questions seriously. We can do that. And, questions are a way to put more and more people's love and mind and care and all the things that we're called to do. It helps us keep that sermon centered in the community. And hey, that's one of my assumptions. I said earlier, declare your assumptions. That's it, keeping the sermon centered in the community. So I'm Chad Brooks. It's been great hanging out with you in your ears today, and I will see you back in the next episode. Remember, Productive Pastor Community, the Productive Pastor, that's the party on Facebook, and then RevChadBrooks.com for every single thing else. I'll see you back next time.